For 20 years, Silas Blackwood's only companion had been his Montana ranch, a vast expanse filled with the ghosts of words he never said, and the deafening echo of a slammed door. A man isn't known by the calluses on his hands, but by the wounds he won't show, and Silas's was shaped like his daughter Lily. Their rift began with a fight, a simple clash between a stubborn father and a daughter who just wanted to be seen. He chose his pride. She chose the road. The silence that followed became his life's work, a routine as predictable as the sun and wind, where nothing ever changed. It was safe, or so he thought. Yesterday, while checking the north fence line, a part of the property he'd let go wild, a place he hadn't stepped foot in since he was a boy, his whole world tilted on its axis. His boot struck something half buried in the soil. Kneeling, his joints protesting, he unearthed a small wooden box, Lily's memory box, the one he thought she'd taken. With trembling hands, he worked the rusted latch. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, were dried wildflowers, a polished river stone, and a single folded photograph. It was Lily, her face etched with years he hadn't witnessed, and beside her stood a teenage boy with his own stubborn jawline, a grandson he never knew existed. Suddenly, the silence of the ranch wasn't empty anymore. It was screaming with the life he had missed. Will Silas bridge the chasm of 2 silent decades? Subscribe to follow this powerful story of regret and redemption and discover if a family can be rebuilt from the echoes of the past. The door to the old line shack was ajar. A smell hit me first, not of rot, but of rain and fear, a scent that doesn't belong here. I pushed the door open, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. And then I saw her. A girl, couldn't be more than 19, huddled in the corner. Her eyes were wide, but it was the rusty shackle and chain on her ankle, bolted right to the floorboards, that made the air freeze in my lungs. I took a step back, my mind screaming to call Sheriff Brody, to let the modern world handle whatever this was. But here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. The key was lying on the floor, right beside her, glinting in the sliver of light from the door. My feet felt nailed to the floorboards, just as surely as her ankle was. Call Brody, simple. The words echoed in my head, a rational beacon in a sea of utter madness. But my hand stayed away from my phone. The key. It was a small, ornate thing of brass, tarnished with age. It wasn't just near her, it was within easy reach. She could have grabbed it, could have been free in seconds. Why wasn't she? "Hey," I said, my voice a rough crackle that sounded foreign to my own ears. Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Her wide eyes, the color of a stormy sky, remained fixed on the sliver of daylight at the doorway, as if watching for something. Not at me, not at the key, but at the world outside. The chain clinked softly as she shifted, a sound that cut through the silence like a scream. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on the dusty floorboards. "I'm not going to hurt you," I whispered. "I can help." "The key!" I gestured toward it, and for the first time, her gaze flickered down to the glint of brass. A tremor ran through her body, a violent, full-body shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Her lips parted, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Then she shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A no that was more terrifying than any scream. My blood ran cold. She wasn't a prisoner kept in. She was being kept out. Out of what? Or was something being kept out by her? The scent of rain and fear wasn't just her terror. It was the atmosphere of this place, a warning sign. The shackle wasn't a prison, it was an anchor. And the key wasn't a promise of freedom, it was a temptation. A test. My instinct to call the sheriff warred with a primal fear that told me this was something far older and darker than a simple kidnapping. Getting Brody involved might be like inviting a lamb to a wolf's den. I looked from her terrified eyes to the chain, to the key lying like a silent dare on the floor, and I knew I was standing on the edge of a choice that had no right answer. He found himself unable to call the law. There was something in the woman's eyes that stopped him cold, a chilling echo of Lily's own haunted gaze, the unmistakable look of a soul trapped within a cage of its own meticulous making. Driven by this disquieting memory, he made a choice that defied all logic. He went back to the house, not with threats, but with a canteen of water. She accepted it with a hand that trembled so violently it was a wonder she could hold it. She introduced herself as Sparrow, and her voice was a fragile whisper, a thread of sound laden with cryptic riddles. She spoke of an immense debt she was honor-bound to repay, and of a wandering sickness that the heavy, self-imposed chain was meant to keep at bay. The realization dawned on him that she was the sole architect of her own grim prison, a concept far more terrifying than any external captor. Her self-inflicted torment was a brand of darkness he couldn't begin to fathom. As Sparrow shifted her slight frame, a small folded piece of paper slipped unnoticed from her pocket and fluttered to the dusty floor. He retrieved it, unfolding the worn crease to reveal a faded photograph. It showed a woman with kind, gentle eyes, a complete stranger to him. In that single silent moment, a chilling certainty washed over him. Sparrow's dark, meandering path had not been a random tragedy that washed up on his shore by chance. It had been a deliberate pilgrimage that led her with unnerving precision right to his door. It was then he knew his first great mistake was in thinking he could ever control a situation so steeped in madness. His second and perhaps more foolish error was in believing that the world, with its prying eyes, would fail to notice. By morning, they had arrived. They were not lawmen, nor were they reporters. As Silas looked out the kitchen window, his coffee halfway to his lips, he saw them. Elders from the Stone Whisperer tribe on the reservation stood just beyond his fence line. They did not stand on his land. They stood on theirs, a quiet, powerful guard. Their matriarch, a woman named Lena High Eagle, whose face was a roadmap of dignified sorrow, approached the fence. She looked directly at Silas, her gaze devoid of judgment, carrying instead a deep, weary understanding. "She is on a spirit journey, Silas," she said, her voice calm but firm. "She chose this ground because the invisible wound was dealt here. You must let her finish." In that instant, his simple ranch became the center of a spiritual reckoning he could not understand, a crossroads of histories he knew nothing about. Just as the spiritual matriarch Lena's words settled deep within him, sinking into his very bones with the weight of ancestral truth, another presence made itself known. It was a disturbance in the otherwise tranquil afternoon, a violent punctuation mark on the horizon. A plume of ochre dust, initially a faint smudge against the vast pale sky, began to swell. It churned and grew, a furious cloud birthed from the parched earth of his long, winding driveway. Soon, the familiar silhouette of Sheriff Brody's patrol car materialized within the haze, its form sharp and menacing, as it kicked up the very ground he considered sacred. A cold, tight knot of panic seized his gut, squeezing the air from his lungs. The world suddenly split into two opposing forces, with him at the epicenter. On one side stood Lena, the embodiment of a sacred, ancient way, her counsel urging him to trust the process, to allow what needed to unfold to do so without interference. Her world was one of patience, of spirit, of things not easily explained to the uninitiated. On the other side, barreling down his driveway, was the law. Sheriff Brody represented a world of hard facts, of regulations, of appearances. And from the outside, the situation at the homestead, the silent gathering, the ritualistic quiet, the thing they were guarding, looked all kinds of wrong. It was a scene that would invite sirens, handcuffs, and the cold, sterile judgment of a courtroom. Through it all, Lena didn't flinch. Her weathered face, a roadmap of wisdom and endurance, remained serene. Her dark eyes, deep and unwavering, were fixed on him. They did not command or plead, they simply waited, offering a silent anchor in his rising storm of fear. He felt the weight of that gaze and the collective stare of the other elders who sat like statues carved from the land itself. The crunch of gravel under Brody's tires was now audible, a rhythmic, impending doom. He had to choose. He had to declare his allegiance right there, in that charged space between the old world and the new. He could revert to his old ways, face the sheriff alone, try to explain the inexplicable and inevitably fail, or he could stand with them. After 2 decades of hardened solitude, of believing he could only rely on himself, he took a slow, deliberate breath. The dust settled on his skin, a gritty film, as he gave Lena a slight, firm nod. For the first time in 20 years, he would not be alone. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but he saw the world in black and white. When he got out of his car, his gaze fell upon an old man he believed was losing his grip, hiding a runaway girl who was clearly in trouble. "Silas, what in the hell is going on here?" Brody asked, his hand resting on his belt, his voice cutting through the tense air. Silas tried to explain, but his words felt flimsy against the sheriff's rigid certainty. It was then that Lena stepped forward, addressing Brody not as an authority figure, but as a peer. "Sheriff," she said softly, "this is a matter of healing." She began to speak of her own son, of a painful rupture within her family, a grief that mirrored Silas's own so closely it sent a chill down his spine. As their words hung in the air, a cold wind picked up, and the first few snowflakes of an early winter began to drift down from the grey sky, like a silent, final judgment. As the curtain of falling snow thickened, transforming the familiar, rugged lines of the ranch into soft, alien shapes, Brody finally relented. He agreed to wait out the worst of it, but his posture was a clear declaration. He wasn't leaving. His silent, stubborn presence on the porch was just one front in the quiet siege that had descended upon them. The true enemy was twofold: the relentless storm that was methodically isolating them from the world, and the suffocating silence that had fallen like a shroud over its inhabitants. From the frosted window of the main house, he spent the long grey hours of the day watching Sparrow. She was a fixed point in the swirling white chaos, a dark, still shape huddled within the dilapidated shack at the edge of the property. She hadn't moved since dawn. He could almost feel the biting cold seeping through the shack's thin walls, the frost painting crystalline, unfeeling patterns on the inside of her small prison. Yet she sat, unmoving, wrapped not in a blanket against the physical chill, but in the heavy, intangible cloak of her own atonement. It was a world she had built for herself, a stark and lonely kingdom where relentless penance was the only law. The longer he stared, the more the physical distance between the warm house and the cold shack seemed to dissolve. The glass of the window ceased to be a barrier and became a mirror, and the figure he saw was not just hers, but a painful, distorted reflection of his own soul. He recognized every detail of her self-imposed exile. It was there in the rigid set of her shoulders, a defiant stand against any offer of comfort or grace. He knew intimately that stubborn refusal to accept help, the deep-seated, misguided belief that self-punishment was the only righteous path toward peace. It was a philosophy born of profound guilt, a conviction that one must suffer to earn forgiveness, even and especially if there is no one left to grant it. His own cage hadn't been built of wood and nails, but of a far more durable material: silence. For 20 years, he had meticulously constructed an invisible prison around his heart, brick by unspoken brick. Each memory he refused to share, each question he left unanswered, each apology he swallowed was another bar on the window. He had chosen solitary confinement as his life sentence, and now here was Sparrow, enacting the very same tragedy with a physical structure, a cage of her own making that the whole world could see. The parallel was so stark, so unnerving, it felt like staring at a living ghost. It was a strange, painful mirror that didn't just show his face, but stripped away the decades to reveal the bleak architecture of his own sorrow. The storm raged on, a physical manifestation of the turmoil within him. It was closing them all in, burying the familiar world under a deep, featureless blanket of white. The snow erased paths, obscured landmarks, and muffled all sound, creating a blank slate where the past could no longer hide. He felt trapped, not just by the weather, but by the sudden stark clarity of his own life. The ghosts he had kept locked away in the prison of his silence were now walking free in the whiteout, their whispers carried on the howling wind, surrounding him in the suffocating cold. The blizzard descended completely, a wall of white that cut him off from everything, sealing the small cabin in a world of roaring wind and silent snow. The temperature plummeted with the last of the fading daylight. He paced the worn floorboards, the storm outside a mirror of the one inside him. He couldn't leave her out there like that. A spirit journey was one thing, but this was a deadly cold, an unforgiving force of nature. Purpose hardening his features, he grabbed the thickest wool blanket from the foot of his bed and pulled on his heavy boots. Bracing himself against the punishing wind, he trudged through the knee-deep drifts toward the old, isolated shack at the edge of his property. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with ice crystals, but he pushed on, guided by the faint, wavering light from its single window. Inside, the air was still but held a profound, biting chill. She sat motionless on a simple stool, her eyes closed, seemingly oblivious to the cold, seeping through the thin wooden walls. She looked so fragile, lost in whatever world her journey had taken her to. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her from her trance. As he gently wrapped the heavy blanket around her thin shoulders, his hand brushed against her wrist. He froze, his motion arrested. Something was there, something hard and familiar against her skin. His gaze dropped. There, on her thin, pale arm, was a simple wooden band. His eyes fixed on it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He didn't need to look closer to recognize the delicate, looping pattern of intertwining leaves carved into its surface. His own hands knew that pattern intimately. His own hands had carved it years and a lifetime ago, whittling away the summer hours, pouring all his love and naive hope into the smooth grain of the birchwood. He had made it for Lily. The memory, buried under years of regret and silence, erupted with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the feel of the carving knife in his hand, the scent of the fresh wood shavings, the bright, hopeful smile he had imagined on her face when he gave it to her. It was a relic from another life, a token from the very day before their final, terrible fight. The breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful gasp that hung in the frigid air, a ghost of a sound. The past and the present had just collided with brutal, incomprehensible force on the wrist of this stranger in a snowbound shack. He stared at the small object in her trembling hand, a creation of his own long-forgotten past. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat, hoarse from a sudden, suffocating shock. The girl's eyes, previously distant and clouded with trauma, sharpened with an unnerving focus. They fixed on him, searching, questioning. A single tear broke free, tracing a clean, glistening path down her chapped cheek, a stark line against the grime of her captivity. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice a fragile thing, a thread of sound that trembled with a mixture of biting cold and profound, raw emotion. Her small fingers clutched the object as if it were a sacred talisman, her only connection to a life now extinguished. "She told me to bring it back, to the man who made it." The girl paused, her thin frame racked by a shaky breath that seemed to steal all the warmth from the room. To show him the debt was paid. The words, spoken so softly, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The floor of the shack seemed to drop away from beneath his feet. His world, already so small and precarious, tilted violently on its axis and then shattered into a million irreparable pieces of grief and regret. Outside, the wind howled a mournful, ceaseless dirge against the thin walls of his isolated shack, a symphony for his desolation. But inside his head, the storm was silenced, replaced by a deafening, ringing void. Lily. The name, once a source of warmth and light, now echoed in the hollow, cavernous ruin of his mind. His daughter was gone. The stark, brutal finality of the truth was absolute, undeniable. And this girl, this chained, shivering ghost before him, was the impossible consequence. His granddaughter, the child his beloved Lily had raised in a brutal, unforgiving world he had never been a part of, a world from which he had selfishly hidden. The debt, it seemed, was not just paid, but settled in a currency of flesh and blood he could never have imagined, leaving him utterly bankrupt. Brody's demand cut through the wind's howl. Silas lunged forward, placing himself between the sheriff and the shivering woman. "She's sick, Brody. Can't you see that? It's the fever talking." But Brody's eyes were locked on Sparrow, the glint of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey. He saw not a fragile soul lost in delirium, but the key to a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. Sparrow's head lolled, her gaze unfocused. "The river, it took," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mother said it was an accident, but she chose. She chose to walk away. I have to stay. I have to pay the debt." The words, disjointed and born of hypothermia, struck Brody like a lightning bolt. He remembered the whispers from years back, a local girl who had vanished near the Blackwood River, a case that went cold, leaving a scar on the town's memory. The pieces clicked into place with a terrible, mistaken certainty. He saw a hidden crime, a mother's complicity, and a daughter's inherited guilt bubbling to the surface. "That's enough," Brody said, his voice flat and final. One of the deputies, using a heavy crowbar, finally snapped the rusty bolt holding the chain. The crack echoed like a gunshot in the muffled, snowy landscape. As they reached for Sparrow, Silas threw his arms out, a desperate human barrier. "You're not taking her. She needs a doctor, not a jail cell." The raw plea was lost on Brody, who simply nodded to his men. The struggle was short and ugly, a tangle of limbs in the deep snow. Silas fought with the strength of desperation, but he was outnumbered. Him pinned down, all he could do was watch as they lifted the limp form of Sparrow, her rambling about atonement now a damning testament in the ears of the law. Brody looked back once, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He believed he was rescuing a victim and capturing a witness, entirely deaf to the sound of the truth being buried under a mountain of misunderstanding. The officer took her away. He acted with the unshakable certainty of a savior, totally convinced that he was rescuing the girl from the figure that stood powerless in the snow. From his vigilante perspective, he was breaking a dark chain, freeing her from a twisted family legacy that man represented, a debt that she mistakenly felt obliged to pay. With a gesture that was meant to be protective, but felt like a final judgment, he wrapped her in a thick coat, protecting her from the cold and the life she was leaving behind. He guided her to his patrol car, whose flashing lights cut through the thick falling snow, a beacon of law and order that, for the man who remained, meant only loss. The officer's deputies watched the lone figure, their gazes containing a complex and disturbing mixture of emotions. There was suspicion, a professional distrust of a man implicated in something they didn't fully understand, but had been trained to see as dangerous. Underneath, however, there was a glimmer of pity for the sheer, stark desolation of his circumstances, a man being stripped of his world before their eyes. A short distance away, the tribe watched the scene unfold, a silent chorus of witnesses. They could do nothing, their collective power rendered useless in this confrontation with external authority. Their faces, etched with the lines of generations of sorrow, reflected a deep and shared understanding of this kind of loss, of a family being torn apart by forces beyond their control. And just like that, with the quiet click of a car door, the family he had so recently and miraculously found was snatched away from him. The engine started, a low rumble quickly swallowed up by the wind, and the vehicle drove away, its rear lights a fading red glow in the snowstorm. He stood completely alone in the heart of the storm, a failed father who couldn't protect his daughter, a failed protector who couldn't defend his own. The deep silence he had known before returned, but now it was different. It was heavier, colder, and more absolute than ever, filled with the absence of what had just existed. In the vortex of snow and wind, he felt everything that had once defined him being swept away. He was no longer a rancher tending his land. The land seemed strange to him. He wasn't a father. His daughter was gone. He was nothing but a void, a hollow outline against the white landscape, an empty space where once there had been a man. That night, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world shrouded in a pristine, silent layer of white. Inside his home, a man sat by the cold stove, staring into the darkness as if it held the answers he sought. It was into this heavy silence that Lena High Eagle came, her presence a quiet reckoning. She sat across from him, an island of calm in his sea of turmoil, and began to unspool the rest of the story. The devastating wrong choice he had heard of from Sparrow, the one he had so easily attributed to his daughter Lily, was not hers to carry. The weight, she revealed, was his alone. Her voice, steady and devoid of malice, spoke of her son, of a deep and honest love he held for Lily, and of his desire to build a life with her. He had come to this very house, heart in hand, only to be shattered by an arrogant pride. With cruel words long since buried under years of denial, the man had driven the boy away, telling him he wasn't good enough for a Blackwood. That single venomous rejection had sent Lena's son down a dark and spiraling path, a journey that ended years later in his own definitive silence. In that moment, the entire foundation of the man's grief crumbled. Lily had not been fleeing her own guilt. She had been fleeing his. He finally understood that the true antagonist of his tragic story was not a rebellious daughter or a twist of cruel fate. It was his own fractured image, the cruelest reflection staring back at him from the mirror. The sun rose, pulling long blue shadows from the pines and stretching them across the unbroken expanse of snow. From his window, he watched the world awaken in a silent monochrome, and for the first time, he saw it all with a stark and painful clarity. It was not a gentle dawning, but a brutal illumination, one that cast his entire life in a new, unforgiving light. Every bitter memory he had curated, every year of self-imposed solitude he had endured, it was all recontextualized, reframed by a single terrible truth that had settled in his soul overnight. The injustice he had railed against for so long was real, but he had used it as a shield, hiding his own culpability behind it. He had spent decades tending to his anger, nurturing it like a rare and poisonous plant. It had been his companion in the empty house, his justification for turning away from the world. Now, standing on the precipice of this new day, he saw the final choice that remained. It was not a choice between pride and shame, as he had once believed. It was something deeper, a decision to be made in the very core of his being. He could cling to the familiar righteous anger that had defined him, or he could take the terrifying step toward a transformative forgiveness, not for those who had wronged him, but for himself, for the man who had let bitterness curdle his love and silence his own conscience. The decision was made without fanfare, in the quiet space between one breath and the next. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, a plume of white in the cold air of the room, and with it a lifetime of resistance seemed to dissolve. He moved with a newfound deliberation, pulling on his heavy coat, its familiar weight a strange comfort. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. His boots sank into the fresh powder, cutting the first tracks across the pristine landscape. Each step was a definitive mark, a dark line scarring the perfect white, signifying a path from which there could be no return. The old truck coughed to life, its engine shattering the sacred silence of the morning. As he drove the winding road into town, he did not look back. The sheriff's office was warm, smelling of pine-scented cleaner, stale coffee and damp wool. Sheriff Brody, a man who had seen too much of the town's sorrow, looked up from his paperwork. His expression shifted from dutiful attention to surprise, then to a deep, weary concern. He surely expected another frantic report about the granddaughter, another desperate theory, another plea for action. But the man who stood before him was not the same one who had haunted this office for days. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a solemn calm. His shoulders were straight, his gaze direct and unwavering. He let the silence stretch for a moment, a quiet testament to the gravity of his purpose. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, resonant with a clarity that had been absent for years. "Sheriff," he said, and Brody leaned forward, sensing the shift. "I'm not here to talk about my granddaughter." He paused, letting the words land with their full, unexpected weight. "I'm here to confess to a failing of the heart." After confiding in Brody, laying out the whole sordid story, not as a calculated crime, but as a soul-crushing burden he had carried for years, he knew one final act of contrition remained. The confession had not absolved him. It had merely illuminated the last, most difficult path he had to walk. He drove towards the reservation under a vast, indifferent sky, the familiar landscape feeling alien, each mile marker a judgment on his past. The weight in his chest was immense, a physical presence that made each breath a conscious effort. He stood before Lena and the Stone Whisperer Council, the air in the room thick with history and unspoken grievances. The faces before him were carved from stone and sorrow, their eyes holding the wisdom of generations. He began to speak, his voice a low, unsteady thing in the profound silence. He laid his soul bare, unsparingly recounting every detail. He spoke of the foolish pride that had blinded him, the venomous, cruel words he had wielded like weapons, and the devastating, irreparable consequences of his choices. The narrative tumbled out of him, a torrent of shame and regret that he had held back for a lifetime. He did not seek to justify or excuse his actions. He presented them in all their ugly truth. When the last of the poison was drained from him, he looked at them, meeting their gazes for the first time. He asked for their forgiveness, making it clear that he did not believe he was worthy of it. His plea was not for them, but for himself. He explained how the anger, an old and familiar companion, had once kept him warm against the cold of his own guilt. But now it was a fire that consumed him from within. He could not carry its searing weight for one more day. He had to let it go or be reduced to ash. The silence that followed his words was absolute, a void where judgment could have easily bloomed. There were no easy answers offered, no simple absolution granted that might have cheapened the gravity of his confession. The council members remained still, their expressions unreadable, but their presence immense. But then, as he stood there, stripped of all his defenses, Lena moved. She rose slowly and approached him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, grounding touch that conveyed more than words ever could. It was not a gesture of complete forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, of shared pain. In that quiet, profound moment of contact, a bridge was formed across a chasm of grief. An unspoken, fragile peace settled over the room, a first, tentative step towards mending two families that had been broken by the same tragedy. Sparrow was returned to her. The final click of the station gate closing behind them was a sound of profound finality, sealing off a chapter of darkness. As they walked the dusty road toward the ranch, the world seemed to expand. The vast, open sky, a stark contrast to the confinement the child had known. The air, clean and smelling of sage and dry earth, felt like the first breath after being underwater for too long. For a long while, the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then a small, tentative hand found the grandmother's. It was a connection so fragile it felt as if it could break with a single misplaced word, yet so real it grounded her in this new, hopeful present. The grandmother tightened her grip gently, a silent promise of safety, of home. Looking at her granddaughter, she saw a shadow in the young eyes, a guardedness that spoke of unspeakable things. But beneath it, there was a flicker of resilience. With a sharp, internal pang of relief and sorrow, the grandmother registered the truth. The chain was gone. The silence that greeted them at the ranch was entirely different from the one she had endured for so long. The previous quiet had been heavy, a suffocating blanket of absence and dread, where every creak of the floorboards was a potential harbinger of bad news. It was the silence of a held breath, of ceaseless gnawing worry, but this new quiet was alive. It was not an absence, but a beginning. It was a canvas, waiting for the soft colors of a new life to be painted upon it. It was the quiet of a fallow field, rich with the potential for growth. Here, in this gentle sanctuary, healing could finally take root. Here, old wounds that had been ignored and left to fester could finally be brought into the light, not to be reopened, but to be cleansed and tended with care. This was the quiet space where memories no longer had to be weapons, but could become stories. It was in this peace that the grandmother knew she could finally begin to speak of Sparrow's mother, to build a bridge of words to a woman the child had never known. And in doing so, she would be embarking on her own journey, for she was only now, through the filter of time and the reflection in her granddaughter's eyes, truly beginning to know her own lost daughter.